The courtroom felt heavy and tight, as if the walls were pressing inward, and the air itself was holding its breath while people filled the benches and whispered to each other in low voices, full of judgment and curiosity and quiet excitement, because many of them had already decided how this day would end even before the case was called. And when the doors opened, Angela walked in slowly holding her son's hand, and every step she took echoed across the floor, making heads turn toward her like she was already on display. And Angela kept her eyes forward, even though she could feel the stares on her skin and she could hear the soft laughs that followed her simple shoes and worn coat, and the empty space beside her where a lawyer should have been. And some people leaned toward each other, whispering about how she had no chance and how the company she was facing had money power and sharp lawyers who never lost, while Angela looked nothing like someone who belonged in a courtroom like this. And she sat at the small table alone, placing her warm bag at her feet and squeezing her son's hand just once before letting go. And Caleb sat straight beside her, his feet barely touching the floor, his face calm, but his eyes alert, moving from the judge to the lawyers to the walls covered in old wooden panels that smelled of age and rules and silence. And when the judge finally entered the room, everyone stood and then sat again, and the sound of benches creaking filled the space. And the judge glanced down at the case file before looking up and stopping when he saw Angela sitting alone, and his eyes flicked to the empty chair beside her, and a slow smile crept across his face. Not a kind one, but a small knowing smirk, like someone who already knew the ending of a story. And he leaned back slightly in his chair and tapped his pen once against the desk and said her name aloud, mispronouncing it the first time, and then correcting himself without apology, and the courtroom gave a quiet reaction, a mix of coughs, whispers, and small laughs that Angela tried to ignore as she folded her hands together to stop them from shaking. And the judge cleared his throat and looked at her again and asked in a flat voice, "Where is your lawyer?" And the question landed heavy in the room, and Angela felt her chest tighten as if all the air had been pulled from her lungs. And for a brief moment, she thought of all the nights she stayed awake after long shifts cleaning offices and stores, thinking about this exact moment and how it would feel. And she swallowed hard and stayed quiet for a few seconds that felt much longer, while the judge raised an eyebrow and the company lawyer shifted in his seat, already smiling, and people in the crowd leaned forward, waiting. And finally, Angela spoke softly, but clearly saying she did not have one, and she added, "Your Honor," at the end is a sign of respect. And the judge shook his head slowly, as if disappointed, but not surprised. And he made a note on the paper in front of him and sighed loudly, and that sound alone made a few people in the courtroom shake their heads as if it was already decided. And the company lawyer straightened his suit and prepared his papers like a man getting ready to walk through an open door. And Angela kept her eyes on the desk, trying to stay strong even as her thoughts raced through everything she stood to lose: her small home, her son's school, his sense of safety. And the judge leaned forward, resting his arms on the bench, and spoke about how court rules were clear and how legal cases were serious matters and how representing yourself was risky, especially against a large company. And his tone was not cruel, but it carried a sharp edge, like a warning that came too late. And Angela nodded slowly, because she already knew all of this, and she had known it the moment no lawyer returned her calls or asked for payment she could never afford. And she remembered sitting at her kitchen table late at night with bills spread out and Caleb asleep in the next room while she tried to read the contract she had signed years ago, when the company promised help and security and instead left her with threats and court papers. And as the judge continued to speak, Caleb watched everything quietly, noticing how the judge's smirk faded into boredom, and how the company lawyer looked relaxed, and how the people behind them were already losing interest because they believed nothing important was about to happen. And Caleb did not move or speak, but his mind was sharp and focused, remembering every word he had read and every line. He had studied at the public library after school, while his mom worked late and no one noticed him because to them he was just a child sitting beside a woman who had already lost. And the judge finally stopped talking and asked the company lawyer to begin, and the lawyer stood confidently adjusting his tie and speaking loudly using long words that filled the room and made Angela feel smaller with each sentence. And he talked about breach of contract and damages and responsibility, and every time he paused, he glanced at Angela like she was an example of failure, and Angela tried to follow, but the words felt heavy and fast, and she glanced at Caleb, once seeing him listening closely, his face serious and calm, and that gave her a small sense of strength, even though fear still wrapped tightly around her heart. And the lawyer finished his opening statement with a satisfied smile and sat down, and the judge nodded and looked back at Angela and asked if she understood the charges, and she nodded slowly, even though she did not fully understand them, and she said, "Yes, Your Honor," again. And the judge leaned back and said he hoped she was prepared because this court would not waste time. And that was when the smirk returned briefly, and the courtroom seemed to relax, as if everyone was settling in for a quick ending, and some people even checked their phones or whispered again, and Angela felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall because she had promised herself she would stand tall no matter what. And she took a slow breath and placed her hands flat on the table, feeling the cold wood ground her, and beside her Caleb sat still, his eyes sharp and thoughtful, watching the judge, watching the lawyer, watching the people who laughed and whispered and judged without knowing anything about them. And in that moment, while the courtroom expected Angela to lose, and the judge expected a short case, and the crowd expected nothing more than another poor woman being crushed by a system she did not understand, Caleb noticed everything and remembered everything, and quietly prepared for something no one else could see coming. Angela sat still at the table as the courtroom settled into a quiet rhythm of boredom and confidence from everyone except her. And while the company lawyer arranged his papers with smooth, practiced movements, she felt the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders, and the judge asked her to state her name and background for the record, and she answered politely, her voice steady, even though her heart was beating fast, and she said she was a single mother and worked as a cleaner and lived in a small house on the edge of the city, and the judge nodded as if already placing her into a box. He understood too well, and the company lawyer rose again and asked questions that sounded simple but carried sharp edges, asking when she signed the contract and why she failed to meet certain conditions, and Angela tried her best to answer honestly, explaining that years ago she had trusted the company when they offered help with repairs and fees and promised clear terms and support, and she had signed because she needed stability for her son and because the words sounded fair at the time. And as she spoke, the lawyer interrupted, often correcting her words or twisting them slightly, and each interruption made her pause and start again, making her appear unsure even when she was not, and the crowd watched quietly, some with interest, some with pity, and some with quiet satisfaction that the story was moving exactly as expected. And the judge allowed the interruptions without comment, tapping his pen lightly as if the answers no longer mattered. And Angela felt small, but she continued because stopping would mean giving up, and she thought of the long nights she worked cleaning offices after midnight, her hands raw and tired, while Caleb waited at home doing homework alone, and she remembered how the company letters began polite and friendly, then slowly turned cold and threatening, and how she had gone from office to office asking for help, only to be told she needed a lawyer and money and more time than she had. And when the lawyer asked why she did not seek legal help, she answered truthfully, saying she tried but could not afford it. And the lawyer gave a small laugh, not loud enough to be rude, but enough for people nearby to hear, and he said the court could not change facts based on feelings, and Angela nodded again, because she knew that too, and the judge looked at her with a mix of impatience and formality, and reminded her to answer clearly, and briefly, and she did her best even as her hands tightened together under the table. And through all of this, Caleb remained quiet, watching the way words were used like tools and weapons, watching how tone mattered as much as meaning, and how people listened differently depending on who was speaking. And he remembered sitting in the public library weeks earlier while his mother worked late pulling old law books from the shelf, not because he fully understood them at first, but because he wanted to try, and because no one stopped him. And over time, patterns began to appear, words, repeated ideas connected, and he realized that many rules were not magic, but logic written in careful language. And as the questioning continued, the company lawyer presented printed documents and pointed to lines that made Angela look careless and irresponsible, and each time he did, the judge nodded slightly, reinforcing the picture being painted. And Angela tried to explain that she had never been given full copies or clear explanations, and that she trusted the company representative, who spoke kindly and promised guidance. But the lawyer dismissed her words, calling them assumptions, and the judge reminded her again that contracts were binding, and that understanding them was her responsibility. And the room seemed to agree with him because no one spoke and no one challenged the idea. And Angela felt a deep ache in her chest, not just fear but sadness, because she realized that many people in that room had already decided that her struggle was her fault. And as the lawyer continued, Caleb noticed something small but important. When one document was held up, the lawyer skipped over a paragraph quickly and moved on, and Caleb leaned forward, slightly reading the lines from where he sat, and his eyes narrowed as he recognized a phrase he had seen before in another case summary at the library, a clause about notice and disclosure that required full explanation of terms and consequences. And his heart began to beat faster, but he kept his face calm. And the judge asked Angela if she had anything to add before the lawyer rested his case. And Angela opened her mouth, but stopped because she did not know what else to say. Everything important felt already ignored. And she shook her head slowly and said, "No, Your Honor." And the lawyer smiled confidently and said the company rested and sat down. And the judge made another note and sighed again as if the path ahead was clear. And he looked at Angela and explained that this was the moment where a defense would normally begin, and he spoke carefully, as if teaching a lesson about responsibility and preparation. And he asked if she wished to say anything in her defense, and Angela felt all eyes turned to her, and she felt exposed, like she was standing alone under a bright light. And she thought of saying nothing, because every word so far had only seemed to make things worse. But then she looked at Caleb and saw him watching her with calm, steady eyes, not afraid, not confused, just patient and trusting. And that look gave her a quiet strength, and she stood slowly, her legs unsteady at first, but firming as she straightened. And she spoke about her life. Again, not to beg, but to explain. She talked about working hard and trusting the company and never missing payments when she could help it, and asking questions that were never answered clearly. And she said she never intended to break any agreement, and that she only wanted to protect her home and her child. And her voice did not shake as much this time, and the courtroom grew quieter, not because they believed her, but because she was speaking with a quiet dignity that demanded attention. And when she finished, the judge thanked her and nodded, but his expression did not change, and he leaned back again and said the court would consider her words, but reminded her that intentions did not outweigh written agreements. And that statement felt like a closing door. And the judge looked at the clock briefly and then back at her and said the court would move toward a decision soon. And murmurs spread again, and the company lawyer relaxed even more, leaning back with his arms crossed. And Angela sat down, slowly, feeling drained and small and tired. And she placed her hand over Caleb's for a moment, squeezing gently, as if to apologize for bringing him into this place. And Caleb looked up at her and gave a small, reassuring nod and leaned closer, whispering that he noticed something important. And Angela looked at him surprised, but hopeful, and whispered back that it was not time yet. And he nodded understanding and returned his Attention to the judge and the lawyer and the documents, and no one noticed the quiet exchange because, to everyone else, the story was already written. A single mother without a lawyer, standing against a powerful company with clear papers and confident words, and the judge seemed ready to close the book, but beneath the surface, something was shifting. Slowly, quietly, and carefully as Caleb held on to the detail. He had seen, knowing that the next moment might be the only chance to change everything. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him with clear impatience, as if he had already spent enough time on a case that seemed so simple to him, and he cleared his throat and spoke about efficiency and order, reminding the courtroom that many cases waited behind this one, and that time was valuable, and his tone made it clear that he believed this matter no longer required much discussion, and a few people in the audience nodded quietly, already preparing themselves for the final ruling, and Angela felt the pressure growing heavier in her chest as the judge's words continued, because each sentence sounded like a step closer to the end, and the company lawyer watched closely, his confidence steady and unshaken, while he tapped his pen lightly against the table. And when the judge asked one final time if Angela had anything further to say, she hesitated because she knew that speaking again without clear proof could only make things worse, and she glanced at Caleb, feeling torn between hope and fear, and the judge noticed the pause and raised his voice, slightly asking her to answer clearly, and that sharp sound caused a few people to chuckle quietly, as if the delay itself was proof of her weakness. And Angela swallowed and said softly that she had nothing more to add, and the judge nodded once as if satisfied and began to speak about how the law required fairness but also responsibility, and how contracts existed to protect agreements between parties, and his voice grew slower and more official, like someone delivering a lesson rather than listening to a story, and the courtroom felt distant to Angela now, like she was hearing everything from underwater, and she focused on the grain of the wooden table in front of her, trying to stay calm, and beside her Caleb felt his heart beating fast because he could hear the finality forming in the judge's tone, and he knew that if nothing changed soon, everything his mother feared would come true. And he looked again at the documents on the lawyer's table and the judge's bench, and remembered the skipped paragraph and the familiar phrase, and his fingers tightened together as he thought about the hours he spent reading quietly in the library while other kids played outside, and how at first the words made little sense but slowly began to form patterns and meaning, and how one librarian had noticed his interest and guided him towards simpler books that explained big ideas in clear ways. And he remembered reading about cases where people lost because they stayed silent, and about moments when unexpected voices changed outcomes. And as the judge paused briefly to look at his notes, Caleb made a decision that scared him, but felt necessary, and he leaned toward his mother and whispered again, but this time with more urgency, telling her that something was wrong with the company papers. And Angela felt a sudden rush of confusion and fear, because the idea of her child speaking in court felt impossible and dangerous, and she whispered back, telling him to stay quiet and that it was too late. And Caleb nodded slowly, but did not pull back because he could see the judge preparing to move forward, and the company lawyer straightening in his chair, ready to hear the words he expected. In the room was silent, except for the soft shuffling of papers, and then the judge looked up and announced that he would soon issue a decision, and that was when Caleb acted before fear could stop him, and he stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and the sound cut through the courtroom like a sharp break, and every head turned toward him at once, and gasps spread quickly because no one expected a child to stand, and the judge froze mid-sentence, staring down Caleb with surprise and clear annoyance, and Angela's heart nearly stopped as she reached out instinctively to pull him back down, but Caleb remained standing, his small hands at his sides, his face calm even though his chest was tight. And the judge frowned and demanded to know what was happening, and asked Angela to control her child, and a few people in the audience laughed openly now, because the situation felt almost absurd to them, and the company lawyer smiled again, shaking his head slightly as if amused, and Angela stood as well, apologizing quickly, saying her son did not mean any disrespect, and she tried to guide him back into his seat, but Caleb spoke before she could stop him and asked in a clear, steady voice if he could say something important, and the courtroom fell into a stunned silence, because no one expected such confidence from someone so young, and the judge stared at him incredulous and asked who he thought he was and why he believed he could speak in court, and Caleb swallowed and answered politely, saying he was Angela's son and that he had been listening carefully, and the judge let out a short humorless laugh and said this was not a classroom, and that legal matters were not games, and that the court could not allow interruptions, especially from children, and murmurs of agreement followed from the audience, and the judge told him to sit down immediately, but before Caleb could move, the judge paused again, noticing something in the boy's expression, not fear, not rebellion, but seriousness and focus, and the judge hesitated for a brief moment, perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps because the sudden shift had caught his attention, and he sighed deeply and said he would allow one sentence and no more, and warned that this was highly unusual, and Caleb nodded quickly, grateful for even that small opening, and he took a breath and spoke, clearly saying that the company contract included a disclosure clause that required full explanation of penalties and options, and that his mother had never been given that explanation, and that the company had failed to provide written notice as required under their own terms, and the words landed hard in the silent room, and the judge's expression changed instantly from annoyance to alert focus, and the company lawyer's smile faded as he sat upright suddenly, and Angela stared at her son in disbelief, her fear mixing with a sudden spark of hope, and the audience leaned forward, now no longer laughing but confused and curious, and the judge demanded to know where the boy had learned such language, and Caleb answered simply that he read the contract in similar cases at the library, and the judge raised his hand to stop further speaking and asked the company lawyer if the statement was accurate, and the lawyer hesitated just long enough for doubt to fill the room before he objected, saying that a child could not possibly understand legal documents and that the court should disregard the interruption. And the judge nodded slowly, but did not dismiss the comment immediately, and instead he picked up the document again, flipping through the pages more carefully this time, and the room held its breath as the judge scanned the text, and attention shifted completely, now thick with uncertainty, and Angela felt tears forming again, but this time they were mixed with disbelief and pride and fear, and Caleb finally sat back down his legs, shaking now that the moment had passed, but his eyes still locked on the judge, waiting, and the judge remained silent for several long seconds, reading and rereading a section he had previously overlooked, and the company lawyer cleared his throat, preparing to speak again, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him, and for the first time since the trial began, the judge's smirk was gone, replaced by a serious, thoughtful expression, and the courtroom, which had expected Angela to lose, now waited quietly, unsure of what would happen next. The courtroom remained frozen in a silence so deep that even the smallest sounds felt loud and heavy as the judge continued to read the document with slow, careful movements, turning each page as if seeing it for the first time, and the company lawyer shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence now replaced with tension, as he watched the judge's eyes move across the text, and Angela sat perfectly still, afraid that even breathing might break the moment, while Caleb sat beside her, his hands clenched together under the table, his heart racing now that the weight of what he had done finally settled in. And the judge finally looked up, removing his glasses and resting them on the bench, and his gaze moved first to the company lawyer, then to Angela, and finally to Caleb, and when he spoke his voice was quieter than before, but far more serious, and he asked the company lawyer to explain the disclosure clause mentioned, and the lawyer stood slowly, choosing his words carefully, saying, that the clause existed but was standard language, and that the company always followed procedure, and that the woman had signed willingly, and the judge listened without interruption, but his eyes never left the lawyer's face. And when the lawyer finished, the judge asked a simple question, asking whether written notice of penalties and options had been provided separately as required, and the lawyer hesitated again, and that hesitation spread through the courtroom like a crack forming in glass, and the lawyer answered that notice was included within the contract itself, and the judge nodded slowly and asked whether the clause required verbal explanation or separate acknowledgement, and the lawyer opened his mouth but paused, realizing the danger, and said that such matters were handled by representatives, and the judge leaned forward slightly and asked if any proof existed that such explanation had been given to Angela, and the lawyer flipped through his papers quickly, his movements less smooth now, and admitted that no signed acknowledgement was present, but insisted that company policy ensured compliance, and the judge frowned and made a note, and then turned to Angela, asking if anyone from the company had ever explained the penalties clearly or offered written notice separate from the contract, and Angela shook her head slowly and answered honestly, saying no one had done that and that she trusted what she was told verbally, and the judge nodded again, and the room felt different now, no longer bored, but alert and focused, and whispers spread again, but this time they were not mocking, they were uncertain and curious, and the judge asked the clerk to bring him a reference book, and as it was handed to him, he flipped through it quickly, finding a page and reading silently, and the company lawyer objected, saying the court should not base decisions on interruptions from a child, and the judge looked up sharply and said the court based decisions on facts and law regardless of who brought attention to them, and that statement caused a visible shift as the authority in his voice silenced any further objections, and the judge then addressed Caleb directly, asking him to stand again, and Caleb rose slowly, his legs weak but his posture straight, and the judge asked him how he noticed the clause, and Caleb answered simply that he read similar cases where disclosure rules mattered, and that the paragraph looked familiar, and the judge studied him closely and asked if anyone helped him prepare, and Caleb shook his head, saying he read alone at the library, and that answer drew a soft murmur from the crowd, not laughter this time, but surprise and respect, and the judge asked him to explain in simple words what the clause meant, and Caleb took a breath and explained that the company was required to make sure his mother understood the risks and penalties, and that if they failed to do so, the contract could not be enforced in the same way, and his words were clear and careful, and the judge nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the clarity, and Angela felt tears roll down her face silently as she listened, because for the first time someone was truly explaining what she had never understood. And the judge asked the company lawyer if he wished to respond, and the lawyer spoke again, this time less confident, arguing that the boy's understanding was incomplete, and that the company had acted in good faith, and the judge listened, but his attention seemed divided, and after the lawyer finished, the judge called for a brief recess, and the gavel struck loudly, causing a jolt through the room, and people stood immediately, whispering with excitement as they left their seats, and Angela sat back, stunned, her body finally reacting to the stress as her hands began to shake, and she pulled Caleb into a tight hug, whispering that she was proud of him and that he had been brave, and Caleb hugged her back tightly, his voice small now, as he said he was scared but glad he spoke, and around them people glanced over with new expressions, no longer amused but thoughtful, and some even smiled quietly at the boy as the judge exited the room, and the company lawyer stepped aside, making phone calls quickly, his calm image replaced by urgency, and when the recess ended, everyone returned to their seats, faster than before, eager to hear what would happen next, and the judge entered with a serious expression and wasted no time speaking clearly and firmly, saying that the court would allow further examination of the disclosure issue, and that new attention had been brought to a potentially critical point of law, and the judge emphasized that fairness required full consideration, regardless of assumptions made earlier, and he looked directly at Angela when he said that, and for the first time she felt truly seen, and the judge then questioned the company lawyer more deeply, asking about training procedures, documentation, and oversight, and each answer revealed gaps and uncertainty, and the lawyer struggled to maintain control as his responses grew less convincing, and the judge then allowed Angela to speak again and asked her to describe exactly how the contract had been presented to her, and this time she spoke with more confidence, describing the meeting, the promises, the rushed explanations, and the trust she placed in the representative. And her words were no longer dismissed so easily, and the courtroom listened closely, and the judge nodded occasionally, acknowledging the importance of her testimony. And when she finished, the judge turned once more to Caleb and thanked him for his courage and attention, and told him that the law belonged to everyone, not just those with power and money. And those words echoed through the room and settled deep in Angela's heart. And as the judge prepared to continue the proceedings, it was clear that the case had shifted completely from a simple loss into something much larger, a moment where assumptions were broken and voices once ignored were finally heard, and a courtroom that had laughed at the beginning now sat in quiet respect, aware that they were witnessing something rare and powerful unfolding before their eyes. The courtroom no longer felt like the same place it had been earlier, because the mood had changed in a way that could not be undone, and the confidence that once filled the air had slowly turned into tension and uncertainty as the judge leaned forward again, resting his hands on the bench and looking closely at the company lawyer, whose posture was now stiff and careful, and the judge asked detailed questions one after another about company practices, training records, and proof of disclosure. And with every question, the lawyer answered more slowly, choosing his words with visible effort, and sometimes pausing to look through documents that suddenly seemed less helpful than before. And Angela watched quietly, her heart pounding as she realized the balance of power was shifting inch by inch, and people in the audience leaned forward, no longer bored but deeply interested, because this was no longer a simple case of paperwork and rules, but a story of fairness and truth unfolding in real time. And the judge asked whether the company had ever been challenged before over similar contracts, and the lawyer hesitated before admitting that there had been past complaints, but claimed they were resolved privately, and the judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unsatisfied, and asked why no corrective measures were documented, and the lawyer struggled to explain, citing internal reviews and policy updates without showing clear proof, and the judge took notes carefully, his pen moving slower now, as if each word mattered more than before, and Angela felt a strange mix of fear and hope growing inside her, because she knew that even though things were changing, nothing was guaranteed yet. And she looked at Caleb, who sat quietly beside her, his face serious and thoughtful, his earlier fear replaced by focus, as he listened to every exchange and noticed how the judge asked sharper questions now, and how the lawyer avoided direct answers. And the judge then turned to Angela again and asked her to describe the moment she signed the contract in as much detail as possible, and she closed her eyes, briefly remembering the small office, the friendly representative, the rushed explanations, and the pressure she felt to agree, because she wanted stability for her son. And she spoke slowly, describing how she was told not to worry about the fine print, and how she trusted the promises made verbally, and how she was never told about the severe penalties until much later when the letters arrived. And her voice cracked slightly, but she did not stop, and the courtroom listened closely, and even the judge softened his tone when he asked follow-up questions, clarifying whether she had been given time to review the document or ask questions. And she answered honestly, saying she felt rushed and unsure, but trusted the company because they appeared professional and kind. And the judge nodded again and thanked her for her honesty, and the company lawyer objected, claiming emotional testimony should not outweigh written agreements, and the judge responded, firmly saying emotional testimony did not replace facts, but it revealed context and intent which the law required him to consider, and that statement caused a murmur of approval to ripple through the audience, and the lawyer sat back visibly frustrated as the judge then requested internal company guidelines regarding disclosure and penalties, and when the lawyer admitted such documents were not present, the judge's expression hardened, and he reminded the courtroom that responsibility increased with power, and that companies had a duty to ensure clarity, especially when dealing with individuals without legal training. And Angela felt a tear slide down her cheek, because for the first time someone in authority was saying what she had felt all along, and the judge then asked Caleb if he would like to explain how he recognized the clause again this time, asking him to speak more slowly and clearly for the record, and Caleb stood and explained in simple words how he compared the contract to examples he read at the library, and how similar cases showed that failure to disclose could change enforcement, and the judge listened closely, nodding occasionally, and asked him what made him keep reading law-related books, and Caleb answered honestly, saying he wanted to protect his mom, and that simple sentence struck the courtroom harder than any legal argument, and several people lowered their eyes, quietly moved, and the judge thanked Caleb again and told him to sit, and then announced that the court would take a short break before moving toward a decision, and as the gavel struck, the room buzzed with conversation louder than before. And Angela sat back exhausted, her body shaking as the stress she had been holding finally released, and she hugged Caleb tightly, whispering words of love and gratitude, and Caleb hugged her back, his voice small again, as he admitted he had been afraid to speak but felt like he had to, and Angela kissed his forehead, telling him he did the right thing, and around them people whispered, pointing and nodding, some even offering small smiles of encouragement, and when the court resumed, the judge returned with a serious, calm presence and began speaking slowly, explaining that the law required balance between written agreements and fair practice, and that evidence presented raised serious questions about the company's conduct and compliance. And the room fell completely silent as he explained that failure to properly disclose penalties could not be ignored, and that the contract enforcement was therefore questionable, and the company lawyer stood again, attempting one last defense, arguing technicalities and precedent, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had, and the judge listened, but interrupted, asking whether justice should favor paperwork over truth, and the lawyer had no clear answer, and the judge then stated that the court would rule in favor of Angela, dismissing the claim against her, and ordering a review of the company's practices, and the words seemed unreal as they echoed through the courtroom, and Angela gasped, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face, and Caleb grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly, his own eyes wide with disbelief and relief, and the audience reacted with a wave of sound surprise, approval, and quiet clapping before being silenced by the judge, who reminded them of courtroom rules, but allowed a small smile to appear briefly on his face, and the company lawyer sat frozen, his defeat clear as the judge continued, explaining the importance of fairness and attention, regardless of status or appearance, and he looked directly at Angela and said the law existed to protect people like her, not silence them, and Angela nodded through tears, unable to speak, and as the judge ended the session and the gavel struck one final time, the courtroom that once laughed now stood in respect and silence, watching as a single mother and her son rose together, no longer alone, no longer dismissed, and as they walked toward the exit, Angela felt lighter than she had in years, knowing that even though the battle had been hard and unfair, courage and truth had finally been enough, and Caleb walked beside her, quietly aware that this moment would stay with him forever, a reminder that even the smallest voice could change the course of something much bigger than itself. The courtroom slowly emptied after the ruling, but the feeling inside it stayed heavy and meaningful as people walked out, quieter than before, many of them replaying what they had just witnessed in their minds, and Angela remained seated for a moment, unable to move because her legs felt weak and her heart was still racing, and Caleb stayed close, holding her hand tightly as if afraid that if he let go, the moment might disappear. And the judge gathered his papers calmly, but before leaving he looked once more in their direction, his expression no longer distant or proud but thoughtful and human, and he gave a small nod that Angela returned with deep respect and gratitude. And when they finally stood and walked toward the exit, the company Lawyer avoided looking at them, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a stiff silence. And outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with low voices as people talked about what had happened, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling quietly, and Angela leaned against the wall for support, taking slow breaths as the stress finally began to leave her body, and she whispered thank you over and over to Caleb, her voice breaking each time, and Caleb looked up at her confused by the sudden attention and emotion, because to him he had only done what felt right and necessary, and he said softly that he was just trying to help, and Angela pulled him into another hug, holding him longer this time, feeling proud and safe in a way she had not felt for years. And as they walked out of the building, sunlight poured through the large glass doors, making Angela squint and smile, because it felt like stepping into a new life, and for the first time in a long while she felt hope without fear attached to it. And they sat on the courthouse steps together, letting the moment settle, and Caleb asked quietly if everything was really over, and Angela nodded slowly, telling him that the judge had ruled in their favor and that their home was safe. And Caleb let out a long breath. He did not realize he had been holding and leaned against her shoulder, and for a moment they just sat there listening to the sounds of the city and the distant traffic, and Angela thought about how close she had come to losing everything and how quickly people had judged her without knowing her story, and she realized that what hurt the most was not the fear of losing her home, but the feeling of being invisible and powerless. And she looked at Caleb again, realizing that he had seen her struggle every day and quietly learned how to fight back in his own way. And as they prepared to leave, a woman approached them, slowly introducing herself as a legal assistant who had been sitting in the courtroom, and she told Angela that what she witnessed was rare and powerful, and that Caleb had a sharp mind and courage beyond his years. And she handed Angela a card saying there were people who would like to help guide Caleb if she allowed it, and Angela accepted the card with trembling hands, unsure of what the future held, but open to possibilities she had never imagined before. And as they walked home together, Angela felt the weight of years lifting from her shoulders, and she spoke to Caleb about honesty and courage, and how he had reminded everyone in that courtroom that justice should not depend on money or appearance. And Caleb listened quietly, processing everything. And later that evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table, eating a simple meal, Angela noticed how peaceful the room felt, and how different everything seemed, even though nothing physical had changed. And she realized that something inside her had shifted forever, and she thanked God silently for giving her strength when she thought she had none, and for giving her a son who saw the world not as it was, but as it should be. And news of the case began to spread quietly over the next few days as people talked and shared the story of the boy who spoke up and the judge who listened. And Angela received calls from community members offering support and encouragement and even small help, and she felt overwhelmed but grateful. And Caleb returned to school, where his teachers noticed a new confidence in him, and classmates asked questions and looked at him differently, and he answered simply, never bragging, because he did not see himself as special, just someone who paid attention and spoke when it mattered. And the judge, meanwhile, sat alone in his chambers one evening, thinking about the case and how easily he had assumed the outcome and how close he had come to making a mistake. And he thought about the smirk he wore at the beginning and how it faded when truth spoke from an unexpected place. And he wrote notes to himself reminding that justice required humility and patience, and that lesson stayed with him long after the courtroom emptied. and for Angela, each night felt lighter. As she slept without fear of losing her home, and she watched Caleb read his books with renewed purpose, knowing that his curiosity and courage could take him anywhere, and she promised herself that no matter how hard life became, she would never doubt the power of her voice or her son's again. And the story of that day stayed alive not just as a victory, but as a reminder that change often begins quietly with someone brave enough to stand when everyone else expects them to sit. And as Angela tucked Caleb into bed one night, he asked her if she was still scared, and she smiled softly, brushing his hair back, and said she was not scared anymore because she knew they were stronger than they ever believed. And Caleb closed his eyes, feeling safe and proud, and Angela sat beside him for a moment longer, listening to his steady breathing and understanding that the true victory was not just winning the case, but reclaiming their dignity and hope and future. And as the days passed, Angela carried herself differently, no longer shrinking under judgment, but standing taller, knowing that even when the world laughed at her, she had still been worthy of respect and justice, and that knowledge became her greatest strength moving forward. Life slowly returned to a normal rhythm after the courtroom victory, but it was a different kind of normal for Angela and Caleb, because something deep inside both of them had changed. And even though the house looked the same and the neighborhood sounded the same, the fear that once followed Angela everywhere was gone, and in its place was a quiet confidence that grew stronger with each passing day. And Angela returned to her cleaning jobs, but she walked with her head held higher, no longer feeling invisible or ashamed, and people who once passed her without notice now greeted her warmly after hearing pieces of her story. And she learned that respect could come not from status or money, but from standing firm when it mattered. And Caleb continued his daily routine, going to school, doing homework, and visiting the library. But his love for reading had turned into a clear purpose, and he spent hours learning not just about law, but about history, fairness, and how systems worked, because he wanted to understand how the world treated people differently and how it could be better. And one afternoon, Angela received a call from a legal organization asking if she would allow Caleb to join a youth mentorship program for students interested in law and leadership. And Angela hesitated at first, worried about time and pressure, but Caleb's eyes lit up with excitement, and she agreed, knowing that opportunities like this did not come often. And the first day Caleb attended the program, he felt nervous walking into a room filled with older students and professionals. But he remembered the courtroom and took a deep breath and listened carefully, just as he always had. And the mentors noticed his focus and curiosity and treated him with kindness and respect. And over time, Caleb began to grow not just in knowledge, but in confidence, learning how to ask questions and express ideas without fear. And Angela watched this growth with pride, often thinking back to the day she walked into court believing she would lose everything, and how that moment had instead opened doors she never imagined. And the judge also carried the memory of that case with him, and whenever a new case came before him, he reminded himself to look beyond appearances and listen fully before forming judgment. And he even spoke privately to younger judges about the importance of humility and fairness, sharing the lesson he learned from a child who spoke when adults stayed silent. And the company involved faced further review and quietly changed its practices, realizing that power without fairness could no longer go unchallenged. And while the news did not turn into headlines, it spread quietly through the community, inspiring conversations about justice and courage and the value of listening. And Angela was sometimes invited to speak at small gatherings, where she shared her story not as a hero, but as a mother who refused to give up. And she spoke in simple words, telling others not to be ashamed of asking questions or standing up for themselves. And people listened because her story felt real and close to their own lives. And one evening, as Angela and Caleb sat together on their porch, watching the sky darken, Caleb asked his mother if she thought everyone deserved a fair chance. And Angela smiled and told him yes, even when the world tried to convince them otherwise. and she told him that fairness began with believing in your own worth. And Caleb nodded thoughtfully and said he wanted to help people like her one day, and Angela felt her heart swell because she knew that no matter where his path led him, he would carry empathy and courage with him, and years later people would still remember the quiet boy who stood in a courtroom and spoke truth, and the mother who stood beside him without anger or hate, but with dignity and patience. And even though life would continue to bring challenges, Angela no longer faced them with fear, but with the knowledge that she and her son had already survived one of the hardest moments together, and that bond could not be broken. And on the anniversary of the case, Angela and Caleb visited the library where so much of the journey had begun, and they sat at the same wooden table reading quietly side by side. And Angela looked at her son and realized that the greatest lesson of that day was not about law or victory, but about the power of love, trust, and listening. And she understood that the courtroom had not just changed their future, but it also reminded everyone who witnessed it that justice was alive when people chose to see each other fully. And as they left the library hand in hand, Angela felt gratitude for the past and hope for the future, knowing that no matter how loud the world laughed or judged, she would never again feel alone or powerless. And the story of that day would live on, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest voice carries the strongest truth, and that when love and courage stand together, even the coldest courtroom can become a place of transformation and understanding. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the street, Angela squeezed Caleb's hand gently and whispered that she was proud of him, and he smiled back, knowing that everything he had done began with love and ended with hope, and that was a victory no one could ever take away.